Hello, everyone. Ted Lemon, Littorai Wines. We're going to taste horizontal tasting of 2014 Anderson Valley wines today with you. Thanks for coming to join us. And here's a look at the pivot on this beautiful April afternoon in early April. Lots of sunshine. So hopefully we can share a little sunshine with people, especially those stuck in apartments in the city. And scanning the vineyard over to the barn where we store and keep all of the preparations we use in our farming, and then all the way around to say hello to Sam Ecenia, our assistant winemaker, and I will sit down right next to you, Sam, and we'll do this tasting.
All right. So here we are looking at the 2014 Anderson Valley wines. We have 3 of them here for you today.
We're tasting in order Savoy, Roman, and then One Acre Vineyard. Sam, tell me about Savoy. What do you smell? What do you taste?
So, 14 Savoy for me is it's the out of the 3, it has the most volume. I think there's a lot of primary fruit, good fruit presence, really vibrant acidity. But for me, the most rich and the most giving of the 3.
Yeah, I was struck by the fruit, the primary fruit tones in particular, that they're the most present of any of the wines. So if I'm a person who likes to drink wines that have a lot of fruit, this might be the most attractive to me right now. And then Roman to me, much more in the spice camp, sort of, if you know those red hot candies, almost a little antique drawer. To me, I always think of great Pinot should smell like that room in your great-grandmother's house that you never got to go into and only opened the door on every once in a while, that people hadn't been in for years, that kind of sense of mystery. How would you talk to us about Roman? Like, how do you perceive it?
Roman, on the nose, it's got this beautiful floral and spice notes that really just jump out of the glass. Also, this sort of orange zest, sort of more citrus-like aromas to it.
Yep, that's a signature for Roman for sure. And real tannin presence, right? The wines of Roman, when they're young, are often quite tannic. They take a few years to come around, and then they open to these really interesting exotic notes. But it's a wine that requires a little bit of patience, and since we make so little of it, a lot of people just never get the chance to taste it.
Sure. And interesting, the way we pour these wines, we're kind of moving up in elevation. So
yeah.
Starting valley floor, kind of right outside of Philo there, toe of the slope, and then moving up to nearly 1,100 feet. With
900 with Roman.
900.
Yep. 900.
Yeah.
And then ending at 1 acre, which is at 1,600 feet in elevation. So the name Roman came from Alan Lynn Roman, the original owners of the property. I met them in 1997. It was a planting contract, so this is bare land, beautiful little knoll, little less than 2 acres. And you look down on all of Anderson Valley. You look to the southwest, this beautiful view of the valley southeast rather, as it heads inland. And Al and Lynn leased it to us back in 2008. So they had farmed it themselves. Al was a retired fire captain from Oakland, and he was a guy who was very accomplished. He'd been in the Oakland Hills fires. He'd been all over the world training people. He'd worked in Saudi Arabia training fire crews and all this kind of thing. And he came to me one day when I was visiting the vineyard in 2007 and said, Ted, farming's not for sissies. Do you want to lease it? And I thought to myself, here's this amazingly accomplished guy who's done things that I would never in all my life imagine doing in terms of personal danger, etc. And I said to him, well, I understand, Al, but maybe it's not about being for sissies. Maybe it's just not for certain types of people. And so they leased it to us, and we're forever thankful for them. We still lease it and farm it today. And it's a really special little site.
And hard to get to, right?
Yeah, it's the end of the road, top of the hill, at the deep end of Anderson Valley. And then 1 acre, the last one, of course, our first Pinot Noir back in 1993, 1,600 feet in elevation. To me, rose petal. I always smell rose petal in this wine, and we really think of that as a noble aroma in Pinot Noir, and it has both rose petal and what we describe between us as kind of brushy qualities, like if you were out in a hedge with a machete cutting away at blackberries and stuff, you have that sort of green, fresh, herbaceous quality to the wine, and lots of length. Right?
Lots of length. Yeah, absolutely, and a touch of that like compost kind of funkiness to it as well, adding to a little bit of complexity.
The thing that's a signature for me for Roman or for One Acre is the length on the palate. So this is a really long wine, and I once visited Charles Joguet in the Loire Valley back in the early 1980s. Very accomplished grape grower. The winery still exists. Charles passed away many years ago. Amazing artist. He was an artist, and he spent a whole day with me talking about the Loire Valley and Chinon and all this stuff. And one of the things I'll always remember, the descriptors he gave me, is that great wine, the finish of a great wine, should be like imagining, and this was his image, not mine, but a beautiful woman in an evening gown descending a velvet staircase with an ebony banister. So that you have this image that you never quite know where the finish of the wine is, that, you know, the train of the dress spreads out, the person is gently stepping down the stairs as it comes around a bend, and you never quite know when she's actually on the ground, on the floor, right? And that's a much better description for length of a wine than, you know, oh, it's really persistent, or it's got a peacock's tail, which is what I say all the time. So I'm forever grateful to Charles Joguet for teaching me that one. Yeah.
It's a really fun time to drink these wines for me. I feel that when these wines especially hit 5-6 years, there's an honesty to the wine. I think as the fruit drops away, you're left with a more pure focus of what that vintage looked like. You know, if you picked it a little bit later, that's going to show, and the true qualities of the wine really show. So those flaws can be more apparent, but also the finer notes of the wine really come to the forefront.
We always liked 14 because there is nothing fat about these wines. In other words, plenty of people like richer wines. That it's not a criticism of enjoying richness. It's that what we love is when vintages are distinctive. And 14, the wines are dry. And maybe Roman, more than any, is the perfect example about. There's nothing sweet about that wine. There's nothing New World or overripe. It's I describe it as being a very sober wine. And so for us, that's what we appreciated in the vintage, just like in some others we may appreciate the richness. But a very sort of classically styled, understated vintage.
So, Savoy and One Acre, originally owned by Rich Savoy, farmed by Rich Savoy.
Right.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you met and what that those early years looked like.
Sure. So I met Rich in the winter of 92-93 when we were starting out Littorai, and we were trying to find somebody in Anderson Valley who would actually sell us fruit on a by-the-acre basis, because in Anderson Valley in 1993, the average price per ton was $800, which may not mean much to people, but it's not much. And it was all about sparkling wine. So it was all about volume. It was not about fine viticulture. It was not about reducing yields or any of that stuff. And Rich, whose background was in the book business in San Francisco, and was a very well-traveled, man, as I think I mentioned, loved Burgundy, was the person who had actually interesting clones. And when we approached him, he was the first person to say, yeah, I'll do that. And it was tough in those early years. Of course, there are always problems when you try to create a type of contract that never existed before. And there were some interesting times. And Rich, who I love dearly to this day, is a bit of a mumbler. So sometimes when we'd be on the phone, he'd be like into the third sentence, and I still hadn't understood what he said in the beginning, and yet you're having this really serious conversation about quality and making sure that we're on the same page. And so I always tried to be in person with him if I could, so that I could really understand what he was saying. But really devoted to quality, and he planted Savoy second. So Savoy is actually his second vineyard. The site for One Acre is called Deer Meadows. That's the one that we bought in 2017 from him. So Savoy is still separate, no longer owned by Rich, and owned by the folks at Fell, and just a little bit younger.
And I think what also is interesting about One Acre, some people might not know this, was replanted in 2005.
Yes.
And so could you speak a little bit to the differences in those two?
Sure.
Pre-replant and post?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So we, when we started there in '93, it was AXR rootstock, which is a vigorous phylloxera susceptible rootstock. So it went down to phylloxera, it died to phylloxera. And it was planted to 3 old clones, I have to remember, Martini, Vadensville, and David Bruce, excuse me. And so it was replanted with a different row orientation, a different spacing, a single canopy instead of split canopy, less vigorous, younger vines, different clones. It was all different. And I'll never forget the day when we harvested the grapes. We brought them back down in 2009 for the first vintage in young vines after replanting. And Rich was really nervous about this, and I was nervous about this too. You know, what's it going to taste like? And I went in 48 hours after we had picked and tasted the juice, and I called him up right away and I said, "It's not going to be a problem, Rich. You know, it's the same wine." So it's amazing from a site that has a lot of character, how much the juice actually has a character, right? Mm-hmm. And that was present right away, just after soaking, you know, on the skins for 2 days. No fermentation, nothing. Yeah. We had some other questions, right, that came up from people that we wanted to chat about real quickly.
We did. Which vineyard have you learned the most from farming over the years?
We love that. We got to check a lot of that question. So we're not going to say what the name of the vineyard is. We don't work with it anymore. But in terms of a grower vineyard, it was a very demanding, very difficult site. There were management issues at the site for us. I'm sure some of it was our problems, but you learn a lot about communicating with people, and it can be very frustrating when you're dealing with a site that's marginal and, you know, for whatever reason the instruction doesn't come down right or they don't do what you ask, and then they're not going to be back for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Whereas I think what you learn from your own vineyards is much more subtle, right? You say, oh, okay, I can leave a few more buds at that end of the road because it's more vigorous, and I can reduce the water here, or I'm going to dry farm this part of the vineyard, or whatever it might be. With grower relationships, sometimes it's more the stuff that hits you over the head, like, boy, they sure pruned that too long, and we shouldn't have let them, or I thought I told them not to, or whatever. But you know, it's always a learning process, and I've been growing wine for 40 years, Sam, and I have never come back from a trip to visit a vineyard and said, boy, that was a waste of time. Why did they do that? It's never a waste of time. You always, it can be the middle of winter, there's always something you see, something you learn from. So it's always a learning experience. What else did we have?
We'll get one more here. Let's do, why don't you pick one, Ted?
What do you remember most about the vintage? Really compact vintage, really fast flowering, and then on the back end, moderate temperatures. So everything came in at once, and I've never been more sleep deprived for a vintage than this one. After about day 7, you know, with then assistant winemaker Dan Estrin helping us out, we were walking into the walls. I mean, 20 hours a day, nonstop, you know, try to get the crew a few hours of rest, but it was a brutal vintage, and that's just the way winemaking is. It's you know, it's like you could cook only 40 times in your lifetime, right? It's all or nothing during those few days. But in terms of fruit quality, beautiful, lovely, moderate temperatures, moderate berry size, good yields, end of the drought, as you know, for us. So we were really happy to see the last of the drought years behind us.
We made some good decisions because it paid off.
Well, that's good. Well, thank you guys for joining us. We really think these are wines that will age very well. Love to follow up with any other questions you might have. Feel free to email Sam at littorai.com if you want to know the real scoop, or me if you want to get the party line, Ted at littorai.com. Thanks a lot. Think of everybody who is struggling in these times, and if you have the ability, please, please, please do everything you can to support charity so we all get through this together. Thanks.
Thanks.